I remember the sound of rain against glass, how it blurred the world outside into streaks of yellow light and shadow. The train carriage was nearly empty at that hour, just the two of us sitting across from each other at a small table, the fabric seats worn smooth by countless journeys. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night, and the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks had settled into something hypnotic, almost meditative. Julian sat with his hands folded on the table between us, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain we'd run through at the last station. 38 years old, the same as me, but he carried himself differently than he had when we were boys. There was a stillness to him now, a weight that hadn't been there in our teenage summers. The overhead lights cast everything in that particular fluorescent pallor that makes late-night conversations feel both intimate and surreal. We'd been talking about nothing important. Work, the weather, how the town had changed since we were kids. The kind of careful conversation you have with someone you've known your entire life, but haven't really spoken to in years. But there was something underneath it all, something that made the air feel charged despite our mundane words. Then Julian stopped mid-sentence about his mother's garden, and the silence stretched between us like a held breath. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, his eyes darker than usual in the dim light. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, the train's whistle echoed through the night. "There's something I've never told you," he said, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him over the mechanical sounds of our journey. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with years of unspoken weight. Before I could respond, before I could even process what he meant, Julian reached across the narrow table. His fingers found my wrist, gentle but deliberate, and he lifted my hand from where it had been resting beside my coffee cup. The touch was warm, familiar in a way that surprised me, as if my skin remembered something my mind had forgotten. He placed my palm against his chest, just over his heart, and held it there with both of his hands. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm beneath the cotton of his shirt, but there was something else too. A tremor, almost imperceptible, as if that reliable beat was struggling against something larger than itself. His eyes glistened in the artificial light, but he didn't say anything more. He just sat there, my hand pressed against his chest, letting me feel whatever truth he couldn't find words for. The intimacy of it was startling, more profound than any conversation we might have had. I could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of his skin through the fabric, the slight trembling that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. I should have pulled away. I should have asked what he meant, what this gesture was supposed to tell me. But I didn't. I sat there in the fluorescent glow of that late-night train, feeling the heartbeat of my oldest friend, and something inside me shifted in a way I wasn't prepared for. The moment lasted forever and no time at all. Then the train lurched suddenly as we pulled into the next station, and the spell broke. Julian's hands fell away from mine, and I let my arm drop to my side, but I could still feel the echo of his heartbeat in my palm like a phantom pulse. Neither of us spoke as a few passengers shuffled on and off, their footsteps and murmured conversations filling the space where our silence had been. Julian turned to look out the rain-streaked window, and I studied my reflection in the glass across from me, trying to understand what had just happened between us. The train pulled away from the station, picking up speed as we headed back toward home, but something had been left behind on that platform. Some version of the friendship I thought I understood, some assumption about who we were to each other. In its place was this new thing, undefined and impossible to ignore. As the miles passed and the night grew deeper, I kept thinking about that heartbeat under my palm, the way it had felt both steady and fragile, like something precious that could be lost if I wasn't careful. I didn't know then that this moment would become the fault line that would split my life in two. The before and after that would change everything I thought I knew about myself. But I knew something had shifted. Something had been offered and received in the space between his heartbeat and my open hand, and there would be no going back to the easy distance we'd maintained for so many years. I came home from that train ride to find Clara asleep in our bed, one arm draped over the pillow where my head should have been. The house was quiet in that particular way that houses get late at night, full of the small sounds of a life in progress. The dishwasher humming in the kitchen, the old heating system clicking on and off, our daughter's breathing monitor crackling softly from down the hall. This was my life. Orderly, predictable, contained within the walls of a modest two-story house on Maple Street. Clara and I had bought it 7 years ago when she was pregnant with Emma. We'd walked through every room twice, Clara running her hands along the kitchen counters and talking about where we'd put the high chair, how we'd baby-proof the stairs. I nodded and signed the papers and felt like I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Clara stirred when I slipped into bed beside her, her eyes opening just enough to register my presence. "Everything okay?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. I told her yes, everything was fine, and she settled back into her pillow with a small sigh of contentment. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the phantom pressure of Julian's heartbeat still pulsing in my palm. Clara's breathing evened out beside me, and I listened to the familiar rhythm of our shared nights. We'd been married 12 years, together for 15. We had Emma, who was 6, and Marcus, who was 9. We had a mortgage and a minivan and a carefully maintained lawn that I mowed every Saturday morning at precisely 8:30. My days moved like clockwork. Up at 6:15 for coffee and 20 minutes of reading the news on my phone. Shower at 6:45. Kiss Clara goodbye at 7:20 as she got the kids ready for school. At my desk at Hartwell Insurance by 8, where I spent my days calculating risk and processing claims, translating life's uncertainties into neat columns of numbers. I was good at my job in the way that people are good at things that don't require passion. Thorough, reliable. I could assess property damage from photographs and determine liability from police reports. I could explain deductibles to frustrated customers and write reports that satisfied both company protocol and state regulations. My supervisor, Margaret, had told me more than once that I was exactly the kind of employee insurance companies built their reputations on. But sometimes, sitting in my small office with its single window overlooking the parking lot, I felt like I was watching my life happen to someone else. Like I was processing my own existence as just another claim, calculating the probability that this carefully constructed routine would continue indefinitely. Clara was a kindergarten teacher at the elementary school 3 blocks from our house. She loved her work in a way that made me envious sometimes. The way her face lit up when she talked about her students, how she spent her own money on art supplies and books for her classroom. She was genuinely good, Clara. Kind in a way that came naturally to her, patient with our children in ways I had to work at. Our conversations had settled into a comfortable pattern over the years. Logistics, mostly. Who would pick up Emma from soccer practice? Whether we needed to schedule Marcus for a dentist appointment. What we should do about the leak in the basement. We moved through our days like 2 people sharing space rather than sharing a life, efficient and considerate, but somehow always talking around the edges of anything that mattered. I told myself this was normal. This was what marriage looked like after more than a decade, after children and mortgages and the daily work of building a life together. The intense conversations of our early dating years had been replaced by something more practical, more sustainable. We were partners in the enterprise of family, and that was enough. But Julian's return had stirred something in me that I'd thought had settled permanently into the background. He'd come back to town 6 months ago when his mother's condition worsened. The same woman who used to make us sandwiches when we'd spend entire summer days in their backyard, building elaborate forts out of cardboard boxes and arguing about whether dinosaurs could really fly. Julian and I had grown up 3 houses apart on Elm Street, in one of those neighborhoods where the kids moved in a pack from yard to yard, where summer meant staying outside until the streetlights came on and your mother called you in for dinner. We'd been inseparable from the time we were 8 until we graduated high school. 2 boys who seemed to share the same thoughts, the same dreams about getting out of our small town and seeing what the world had to offer. But life had pulled us in different directions after graduation. I'd gone to the state university 40 minutes away, studying business because it seemed practical, safe. Julian had chosen a small liberal arts college 3 states over, something with a beautiful campus and a creative writing program that his parents worried would never lead to steady employment. I met Clara during my junior year, in a statistics class that fulfilled both of our general education requirements. She was studying elementary education, and something about her certainty, her clear sense of purpose, had drawn me in. When I brought her home to meet my parents, my mother had whispered to me in the kitchen that Clara seemed like the kind of girl who would make a good wife, a good mother. I nodded and felt like I was checking off another box on the list of things a responsible person was supposed to do. Julian and I had kept in touch through letters at first, then emails, then the occasional phone call. But the distance wasn't just geographic. I was building this life with Clara, getting engaged, planning a wedding, talking about where we'd live and how many children we wanted. Julian was working for a literary magazine in Chicago, dating people he never talked about in detail, sending me postcards from cities I'd never been to. Gradually, the calls became less frequent, the emails shorter. We sent Christmas cards with pictures of our lives, mine showing Clara and me in front of our new house, then with Emma as a baby, then with both kids in matching holiday sweaters. His showed glimpses of a life I couldn't quite picture. Urban apartments with exposed brick walls, groups of friends I didn't recognize. Eventually, just his name signed in handwriting that looked the same as it had when we were 17. When his mother got sick, when he made the decision to come home and help her through her final months, he'd called me on a Tuesday evening in September. I'd been loading the dishwasher while Clara helped Marcus with his math homework at the kitchen table. Julian's voice on the phone sounded exactly the same as it had 20 years ago, and for a moment I felt like I was 18 again, making plans to meet up after school. The town hadn't changed much in the years Julian had been away. The same tree-lined streets, the same small downtown with its handful of shops, and the old movie theater that showed films 6 months after they'd played everywhere else. Main Street still had the same rhythm it had always had. The morning rush of people heading to work, the afternoon lull when the only activity was elderly couples walking their dogs and mothers pushing strollers. There was something both comforting and suffocating about the unchanging nature of it all, like living inside a snow globe where the same scene played out season after season, beautiful in its constancy, but sealed off from anything unexpected or transformative. Julian called on a Saturday morning while I was drinking coffee and watching Marcus practice his batting stance in the backyard. Clara was at the kitchen table grading spelling tests, her red pen moving in small, precise corrections across the papers. Emma was still in her pajamas, building an elaborate city out of blocks on the living room floor. He needed help clearing out his mother's house, Julian said. She'd passed 3 weeks earlier, and he'd been putting off the overwhelming task of sorting through 60 years of accumulated life. His voice carried a weight I recognized from my own experience with loss, that particular exhaustion that comes from handling all the practical details when what you really want to do is sit quietly and remember. I found myself hesitating. Saturdays were family time in our house, an unspoken rule that had developed over the years. We went to the farmer's market, took the kids to the park, worked in the garden while they played in the yard. Clara and I had built our weekends around these shared rituals, and the idea of disrupting that routine felt somehow significant, like I was choosing something I couldn't quite name over something I was supposed to want. But Clara looked up from her grading when I explained, her brown eyes thoughtful. "You should go," she said, capping her red pen and setting it down on the stack of papers. "You could use a break." The way she said it made me wonder what she'd been noticing that I hadn't, what signs of restlessness or dissatisfaction she'd picked up on that I'd thought I was hiding. So I found myself standing on the front porch of Mrs. Henderson's house that afternoon, breathing in the familiar scent of the climbing roses that still grew wild along her fence. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do, but the blue paint on the shutters was the same shade it had been 25 years ago. Julian answered the door wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans with holes in the knees, looking more like the teenager I remembered than the careful adult I'd sat across from on the train. His dark hair was mussed, and there was dust on his hands from whatever he'd been sorting through before I arrived. The inside of the house was exactly as I remembered it. The same floral wallpaper in the hallway, the same family photographs climbing the staircase wall, the same smell of lavender and old wood that had always made me feel welcome when we were boys. But now there were cardboard boxes everywhere, stacked in corners and lining the walls, each one labeled in Julian's neat handwriting. Kitchen, bedroom, books, linens. We started in the living room, working our way through boxes of photographs that Mrs. Henderson had apparently been organizing for years. There were entire shoeboxes dedicated to Julian's childhood, carefully labeled envelopes full of school pictures and birthday parties and family vacations. I found myself in many of them, a skinny kid with unruly hair grinning next to Julian in front of Christmas trees and at summer barbecues. Here we were at 10, standing in the backyard holding up a fish Julian had caught at the lake behind town. There we were at 14, sitting on his front steps with our arms slung around each other's shoulders, both of us trying to look older than we were. In every photograph, we looked so certain of ourselves, so unguarded in our friendship. It was startling to see how close we'd been, how naturally we'd moved through the world as a unit. Julian picked up a picture of us from senior year, taken at the spring formal. We were both wearing rented tuxedos that didn't quite fit, standing with our dates, but somehow still gravitating toward each other. I remembered that night, how we'd spent more time talking to each other than dancing with the girls we'd asked. How we'd ended up sitting on the hood of my car in the school parking lot after everyone else had gone home, talking about what we thought college would be like, what kind of lives we wanted to build for ourselves. "Remember this one?" Julian said, holding up another photograph. We were maybe 16, sitting on the dock at Miller's Pond with our feet dangling in the water. The sun was setting behind us, and we both looked completely at peace, like we had all the time in the world. I remembered that day. We'd ridden our bikes out to the pond after school, planning to fish, but ending up just talking instead. About music, about books, about whether we believed in God, and what we thought happened after people died. The kind of conversations that felt incredibly important when you were 16, the kind that made you feel like you were discovering something profound about the world and your place in it. We moved through the boxes slowly, getting distracted by letters Mrs. Henderson had saved from when Julian was in college, postcards from his travels, report cards and certificates, and all the small documentation of a life well lived. Julian would pick up an object and tell me the story behind it, his voice warm with memory but tinged with the sadness of knowing there would be no new stories to add. Somewhere in the late afternoon, as the light was starting to fade through the living room windows, I asked him about his life in Chicago, whether he'd been happy there, whether he missed it now that he was back. Julian was quiet for a long moment, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a box of his mother's books balanced on his knees. "I never married," he said finally, his voice light but careful. "Never found the right person, I guess." He didn't look at me when he said it, instead focusing on a worn copy of poetry by Mary Oliver that he'd pulled from the box. There was something underneath his words, though, a shadow that made me wonder what he wasn't saying. The statement hung in the air between us, and I found myself thinking about all the ways our lives had diverged after high school. How I'd followed what seemed like the expected path: college, marriage, children, the steady accumulation of responsibility and routine. How Julian had chosen something different, something that had kept him unattached, moving through the world without the anchors I'd thought were necessary for a meaningful life. As the sun set completely, and we switched on the lamps Mrs. Henderson had placed in every corner of her living room, Julian suggested we take a break. "We could go into the city," he said, "maybe get dinner somewhere we used to go when we were younger. Take the train, like we used to." The way he said it made something shift in my chest. There was an invitation in his voice that went beyond just dinner, beyond just nostalgia for our shared past. When I looked at him across the cluttered living room, surrounded by the artifacts of his childhood, he was looking back at me with an expression that was both familiar and completely new. His eyes held mine for just a moment longer than casual conversation required, and I felt that same electric charge I'd experienced on the train weeks earlier. There was something he wanted to tell me, something that had been building in the space between his careful words and his careful silences. I said yes before I could think too hard about what I was agreeing to. Clara wouldn't expect me home until late anyway, and the kids would be in bed by the time I got back. It felt like the most natural thing in the world to follow Julian out of his mother's house and walk with him toward the train station, even though some part of me knew that this was the moment when everything would begin to change. The evening air was cool against my face as we made our way through the familiar streets of our childhood, and I found myself noticing details I'd stopped seeing years ago. The way the streetlights created pools of warmth in the gathering darkness. The sound of our footsteps echoing off the sidewalk in a rhythm that reminded me of all the times we'd walked these same paths when we were young and certain that the world was full of infinite possibilities. That train ride home from the city changed something fundamental in the rhythm of my days. What had started as helping an old friend with a difficult task began to feel like something else entirely, something I couldn't quite name, but found myself craving in ways that surprised me. I started finding reasons to see Julian. Small things at first, practical excuses that felt legitimate even to myself. I'd stop by his mother's house after work to help him carry boxes to his car for donation runs. I'd offer to drive him to the grocery store since he didn't have a car yet, his old Honda having given up during the winter before his mother died. These errands gave us time to talk in a way we hadn't since we were teenagers. Long stretches of conversation that meandered from memory to philosophy to the small observations that make up the texture of daily life. Julian had always been thoughtful, even as a boy, but now there was a depth to his attention that I found both compelling and unsettling. He asked questions that no one else in my life had asked in years. What did I dream about at night? What thoughts kept me awake when sleep wouldn't come? Whether I felt truly happy or just content, and if I understood the difference between those two states. These conversations usually happened during our walks through Memorial Park in the early evening, when the light was soft and golden and the world felt hushed in that particular way that makes honest conversation feel both inevitable and safe. Julian would ask these questions as we walked the path around the pond, his voice casual but his attention complete, as if my answers mattered to him in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud to anyone. How sometimes I felt like I was living someone else's life, following a script I'd never consciously chosen, but somehow couldn't deviate from. How I loved Clara and the children, but felt like I was watching our family life through glass, present, but somehow not fully engaged. How I'd lie awake some nights wondering if this careful, ordered existence was all there was, or if I'd missed some crucial turn that would have led to something more vital, more real. Julian listened without judgment, his dark eyes serious in the fading light. He had a way of nodding that made you feel heard, understood in a way that went beyond words. Sometimes he would ask follow-up questions that cut straight to the heart of what I was really trying to say. Other times he would just walk beside me in comfortable silence, letting my words settle in the space between us. I began to notice things about Julian that I hadn't paid attention to before, or perhaps hadn't allowed myself to notice. The way his hand would brush against my arm when he was making a point, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but happened too often to dismiss. How he leaned slightly toward me when we sat together on park benches or in coffee shops, creating an intimacy of proximity that felt both natural and charged with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. There was something different about laughter when Julian was the one causing it. It came from a deeper place, felt more genuine than the polite amusement that marked most of my social interactions. When Julian told stories about his time in Chicago, about the eccentric writers he'd worked with at the literary magazine or the small adventures he'd had exploring the city, I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in years. The sound of it surprised me, as if I'd forgotten what real joy felt like. At home, these changes in my internal landscape began to show in ways I couldn't quite hide. Clara noticed my distraction during dinner conversations, how I would drift off in the middle of her stories about difficult parents at school conferences or the kids' small triumphs and struggles. She would say my name twice before I'd realize she was talking to me, and I'd have to ask her to repeat what she'd said. Marcus asked me once why I seemed sad, his 9-year-old directness cutting through the careful politeness that had become our family's default mode. I told him I wasn't sad, just thinking about work, but the question stayed with me. Was I sad? Or was I something else entirely? Restless, maybe. awakening to possibilities I'd thought were closed to me forever. Clara began staying up later, grading papers at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep, and I wondered if she was avoiding the bedroom, avoiding the space where my restlessness would be most apparent. She didn't ask directly about my frequent absences, but I could feel her questions in the way she looked at me when I said I was going to help Julian with something, the slight pause before she nodded and told me to drive safely. The evening that changed everything started with rain. Not the gentle summer rain that encourages you to sit on the porch and watch it fall, but the kind of October storm that arrives with serious intent, bringing wind that rattled the windows and thunder that made the children nervous. Clara had put them to bed early and settled in the living room with a book, the lamp beside her chair creating a circle of warm light while the storm raged outside. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the rain slash across the glass in diagonal lines, when my phone buzzed with a text from Julian. "Just the storm making me nostalgic," he wrote. "Want to come over for a drink and wait it out?" I should have said no. It was almost 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and I had work in the morning. The responsible thing would have been to stay home with my family, to read a book or watch television until the storm passed and I could go to sleep at a reasonable hour. Instead, I found myself telling Clara I was going to check on Julian, make sure he was okay in his mother's old house during the storm. She looked up from her book with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between understanding and resignation, and told me to be careful on the roads. The drive to Julian's took twice as long as usual, the rain reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead of my headlights. But when he opened the door, silhouetted against the warm light of the living room behind him, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours and could finally exhale. He'd changed since his mother's death, moved back into the house that had been his childhood home. Being there felt like stepping back in time, but also like stepping into something new and undefined. The living room looked almost exactly as it had when we were teenagers, the same furniture arranged in the same pattern, but the family photographs had been replaced with books, and there was a quality to the silence that spoke of solitude rather than family life. Julian poured us each a glass of red wine, and we settled into the familiar chairs where we'd spent countless afternoons as boys. But now there was something different in the air between us, a weight of unspoken things that made every gesture feel significant. The storm continued outside, rain drumming against the windows with increasing intensity, and Julian got up to turn off most of the lights, leaving just the lamp beside his chair and the flicker of lightning illuminating the room in brief, dramatic intervals. He went to his mother's old record player, a vintage turntable that still sat in its place of honor on the bookshelf, and put on an album we used to listen to when we were 17. The opening notes of a song I hadn't heard in 20 years filled the room, and suddenly I was transported back to a time when the future felt infinite and full of possibility. "Do you remember this?" Julian asked, settling back into his chair with his wine glass cradled in both hands. "We used to play this album over and over that summer before senior year. We thought it was the most profound thing ever recorded." I remembered. We'd spent entire afternoons in this same room, lying on the carpet with our eyes closed, letting the music wash over us while we talked about what we wanted our lives to become. We'd been so certain then that we would remain friends forever, that geography and time and the complications of adult life could never diminish what we shared. The music played on, and I felt the years dissolving like sugar in water. The careful boundaries I'd built around my life, the roles I'd learned to play so well, all of it seemed suddenly arbitrary, temporary. Julian was watching me with that same intensity one remembered from our teenage years, as if he could see something in me that I couldn't see in myself. When the album ended, we sat in silence except for the sound of rain against the windows. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I realized I had no desire to leave, no pull toward the responsible choice of going home to my orderly life. In this dim room with Julian, surrounded by the artifacts of our shared past, I felt more like myself than I had in years. He walked me to the door when I finally forced myself to leave, close to midnight with the storm still raging outside. As I was putting on my jacket, Julian touched my shoulder, a gesture so gentle and brief it might have been nothing. But in that moment, Standing in the doorway between his warm house and the wild night beyond, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unmappable. The drive home was treacherous, the road slick with rain and littered with fallen branches. But I barely noticed the conditions, my mind replaying every moment of the evening, every word and gesture and silence. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt like I'd stepped out of one life into the possibility of another, and I wasn't sure I could find my way back to who I'd been just a few hours earlier. 3 weeks passed before we found ourselves on another late-night train, but those 21 days felt like months. Julian had finished clearing out his mother's house, donating what could be donated, and storing the irreplaceable things in a small storage unit across town. He'd been staying in a rented room above the bookstore on Main Street while he decided what to do next, whether to return to Chicago or make some other kind of fresh start. I'd helped him move the last of the furniture on a Saturday morning, Clara and the kids at her sister's house for the weekend. Standing in his childhood home for what might be the last time, seeing the empty rooms where we'd spent so many hours as boys, felt like closing a chapter of our lives that I wasn't ready to finish. Julian suggested dinner in the city, one last train ride before he made his decision about leaving town again. There was something different in his voice when he asked, a weight that made the invitation feel more significant than our previous excursions. I said yes without hesitation, though I couldn't have explained why it felt so important to say yes. The train was nearly empty again, just a handful of passengers scattered across the car in the way that late Tuesday evening trains always are. We found the same table we'd occupied weeks earlier, the memory of that first charged moment still electric in the space between us. But tonight Julian seemed different, more focused, as if he'd made some decision that had been weighing on him for a long time. We talked about surface things at first, his plans, my work, the way autumn was settling over our small town with its familiar rhythm of cooling air and changing leaves. But underneath the ordinary conversation, I could feel something building, the same energy that had been accumulating between us for weeks now threatening to finally break through into words. Julian kept looking out the window at the dark countryside rushing past, then back at me, as if he was trying to find the courage for something. His hands rested on the small table between us, and I noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he would start to speak and then stop himself, settling back into safer territory. Finally, somewhere between stations, he went quiet in the middle of a sentence about whether he should put his mother's house on the market. The silence stretched between us, but this time it felt different from our comfortable, quiet moments. This felt like a held breath, like the moment before something irreversible happens. "Nathaniel," he said, and something in the way he spoke my name made me look up from my coffee cup to meet his eyes. "There's something I've never told you. Something I've been carrying for so long that I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't real anymore." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt my heart rate quicken in a way that reminded me of standing at the edge of a high diving board as a child, knowing that the only way forward was to jump, but terrified of what would happen when I hit the water. Julian reached across the table then, his movements careful and deliberate, and took my hand in both of his. But this time he didn't press it against his chest. Instead, he held it gently, his thumbs moving across my knuckles in small, nervous circles while he found the words for whatever truth he was about to share. "I've been in love with you since we were 17 years old," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe longer than that. Maybe since we were kids riding our bikes through the neighborhood, and I thought the feeling in my chest was just excitement about having a best friend who understood me completely." The train swayed gently as it took a curve, and I felt like the motion was happening inside me. Everything I thought I knew about my life and myself shifting into a new configuration. Julian's eyes never left mine as he continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I never said anything because you seemed so certain about the direction your life was taking. College, Clara, marriage, the family you wanted to build. And I convinced myself that what I felt was just the intensity of friendship, just nostalgia for our childhood, just my own confusion about what I wanted from life." His hands tightened slightly around mine, and I could feel that same tremor I'd noticed in his chest weeks ago, as if something deep inside him was finally being released after years of careful containment. But when I came back here, when I saw you again after all these years, I realized I'd been lying to myself. About what I felt then, about what I feel now. About what it means to love someone so completely that their happiness becomes more important than your own truth. I sat there listening to his words, feeling like I was hearing something I'd been waiting my entire life to understand, even though I couldn't have articulated what I was waiting for until this moment. Julian's confession wasn't just about his feelings for me. It was about the space between us that had always felt different from my other relationships. The way our friendship had carried an undercurrent of intimacy that I'd never questioned but never fully acknowledged either. He lifted our joined hands then, pressing my palm against his chest the way he had that first night, and I felt that same steady, trembling heartbeat beneath his shirt. But now I understood what it was trying to tell me, what he'd been offering in that gesture that I hadn't been ready to receive. "It's yours," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This heart, these feelings, this love I've carried for more than 20 years. It's yours to hold or to leave behind. But I can't pretend anymore that it doesn't exist, that seeing you hasn't awakened everything I thought I'd learned to live without." I felt overwhelmed in a way I'd never experienced before, as if every emotion I was capable of feeling was happening simultaneously. Shock, because even though some part of me had sensed the undercurrent in our recent interactions, I hadn't allowed myself to imagine this level of depth to Julian's feelings. Unsettled, because his words were asking me to reconsider not just our friendship, but fundamental assumptions about who I was and what I wanted from life. But underneath the shock and the confusion was something else entirely. Relief, as if some part of me had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone to speak this particular truth. As if Julian's confession wasn't just about his feelings for me, but about feelings I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten they existed. I tried to speak, to find words for the chaos of emotions moving through me, but nothing came. How do you respond to someone telling you they've loved you for more than half your life? How do you process the realization that the friendship you thought you understood was actually something much more complex, much more profound than you'd ever allowed yourself to consider? Julian seemed to understand my silence, the way he'd always understood things about me that I couldn't articulate. He released my hand and settled back in his seat, but his eyes remained on mine, patient and open and somehow peaceful despite the magnitude of what he'd just revealed. The train continued its steady rhythm through the dark countryside, carrying us past farmhouses with warm windows and small towns marked only by clusters of streetlights. The sound of wheels on tracks filled the space where words should have been, a mechanical lullaby that somehow made the silence between us feel safe rather than awkward. I found myself thinking about all the moments between us that suddenly made sense in this new context. The way Julian had looked at me during our teenage years, a attention that had felt more intense than simple friendship, but that I'd attributed to the natural intimacy of boys who'd grown up together. The sadness in his eyes when I'd gotten engaged to Clara, which I'd thought was just the normal melancholy of friends whose lives were taking different directions. The way he'd never married, never found the right person, because the person he'd wanted had built a life with someone else, had followed a path that seemed to preclude the possibility Julian was now offering. As the miles passed and our small town grew closer, I realized that Julian's confession had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of myself. Not just about my feelings for him, but about the careful, ordered life I'd constructed and whether it was really what I wanted or simply what I'd thought I was supposed to want. The train began to slow as we approached our station, but neither of us moved to gather our things. We sat in the fluorescent light of the nearly empty car, the weight of Julian's words settling between us like snow, quiet and transformative and impossible to ignore. The train pulled into our station just after midnight, but I felt like I'd been traveling for years instead of hours. Julian's words echoed in my mind as we walked to our cars in the nearly empty parking lot, the weight of his confession settling into my bones like a fever that changes everything from the inside out. We said goodbye with the careful politeness of people who've just shared something too profound for casual conversation. Julian's eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I could see the question there, the quiet hope mixed with resignation. He wasn't asking for an answer yet, wasn't pushing for resolution. He was simply letting me carry the truth he'd finally been brave enough to speak. I drove home through the empty streets of our small town, past the familiar landmarks of my carefully constructed life. The elementary school where Clara taught, where my children would graduate in a few years. The insurance office where I spent my days calculating other people's risks while avoiding any real examination of my own. The park where Julian and I had been walking together for months, slowly rebuilding a connection I now understood had never really broken, just buried itself beneath the acceptable distance of adult friendship. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, Clara and the children long asleep. I sat in my car for several minutes, looking at the windows of the home I'd helped choose, the mortgage I'd signed, the life I'd built with such careful intention. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left for dinner, but I felt like a different person was looking at it now. Inside, I moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. I checked on Emma and Marcus, both sleeping peacefully in beds surrounded by the comfortable chaos of childhood, books and toys, and drawings taped to walls. They looked so innocent in sleep, so trusting that the world they woke up to each morning would remain stable and predictable. Clara stirred when I slipped into bed beside her, her eyes opening in the darkness. "How was dinner?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep, but somehow alert underneath, as if she'd been waiting for me to come home, even in her dreams. "It was good," I said, the words feeling inadequate for everything that had transpired between Julian and me on that train. We talked about old times, about his plans now that his mother's affairs are settled. Clara nodded against her pillow, but I could feel her studying me in the darkness, the way she'd been studying me for weeks now. There was something in the quality of her attention that made me think she knew more than she was saying, that she'd been reading the signs of my transformation even when I hadn't fully understood them myself. The next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I went to work, processed claims, attended Marcus's soccer practice and Emma's school play. I made dinner conversation and helped with homework and maintained all the routines that held our family life together. But underneath the surface performance, Julian's words played on repeat in my mind like a song I couldn't stop hearing. "It's yours to hold, or to leave behind. But I can't pretend anymore." Clara watched me with increasing concern as the week wore on. I could feel her questions accumulating in the spaces between our conversations, in the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. At dinner on Friday night, after the children had been excused to play video games in the living room, she finally asked what had been weighing on both of us. "Nathaniel," she said, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate care, "is there someone else?" The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. I could have lied, could have deflected with talk about work stress or midlife restlessness. But looking at Clara across our kitchen table, seeing the quiet devastation already forming in her eyes because she knew what my hesitation meant, I found I couldn't add dishonesty to everything else I was about to destroy. "Yes," I said, the word falling between us like a stone dropped into still water. "But it's not what you think. It's not a typical affair, not someone I met at work or online or through some deliberate choice to step outside our marriage." Clara's face went very still, and I could see her preparing herself for whatever explanation I was about to offer. Her hands remained folded on the table, but I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers that she was trying to control. "It's Julian," I said, the name feeling strange in this context. In this kitchen where we'd planned family vacations and discussed parent-teacher association meetings. There's something between us that I've never understood before, something that's been growing since he came back to town. Something I think has been there for most of our lives, but I was too afraid or too focused on doing what I thought I was supposed to do to recognize it. The silence that followed was different from any quiet we'd shared in our 12 years of marriage. This wasn't the comfortable silence of people who knew each other well enough not to need constant conversation. This was the silence of a life being dismantled, of assumptions being revised and futures being reconsidered. Clara looked at me for a long time, her brown eyes moving across my face as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but weighted with a sadness that seemed to come from someplace deeper than just this moment, this conversation. "I've known something was missing," she said quietly. "In our marriage, in the way you look at me, in the way you move through our life together. I've known for years that there was some part of you that I could never reach, some room in your heart that was locked to me. I just never understood what it was, or who held the key." The honesty in her words hit me harder than anger would have. She wasn't surprised by my revelation, just confirmed in something she'd suspected but hadn't wanted to examine too closely. We'd built our marriage on compatibility and shared goals rather than passion, and while that had been enough to create a stable, loving home for our children, it had never been enough to create the kind of deep connection that transforms two people into something greater than the sum of their parts. We talked until nearly 2 in the morning, sitting at that kitchen table while our children slept upstairs, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening in the rooms below. Clara cried, but gently, as if she was grieving something she'd already known was lost. I cried too, for the pain I was causing her, for the life we'd built together that was good but not great, not transcendent in the way I was finally beginning to understand relationships could be. She asked me what I was going to do, and I told her I didn't know yet. I needed time to think, to understand what Julian's confession meant not just for my feelings, but for my responsibilities, my children, the promises I'd made when I'd stood at an altar 12 years ago and vowed to love and honor her for the rest of my life. But even as I said I didn't know, some part of me was already walking away from this kitchen, away from this life, toward whatever Julian was offering. The choice had been made the moment he'd placed my hand over his heart on that first train ride. I just hadn't been ready to acknowledge it yet. I spent the following days walking through our town at night, after Clara and the children were asleep. I walked the streets of my childhood, past the houses where Julian and I had grown up, past the park where we'd spent so many afternoons talking about our dreams for the future. I walked past the school where Clara taught, the office where I worked, all the landmarks of the life I'd built with such careful intention. With each step, I felt the weight of the choice I was facing. On one side was stability, responsibility, the love I felt for my children, and the respect I had for Clara. On the other side was something I'd never experienced before, but recognized as essential, a connection to another person that felt like coming home to a self I'd never fully known existed. By Thursday night, the decision had crystallized into something clear and unavoidable. I drove to the bookstore where Julian was staying, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. A light rain had started to fall, the kind of October drizzle that makes everything look softer, more forgiving. He was waiting in the doorway before I even knocked, as if he'd been watching for me from the window upstairs. The light from inside framed his silhouette, and I could see in his posture both hope and fear, the understanding that whatever had brought me here at 9 o'clock on a rainy Thursday night was going to change everything for both of us. Neither of us spoke as I stood there on his doorstep, rain beginning to darken my jacket and drip from my hair. Julian's eyes searched my face, reading the decision I'd carried with me through days of sleepless nights and endless walking. He stepped back from the doorway, not in retreat but in invitation, making space for me to enter. I crossed the threshold without a word, feeling like I was stepping out of one life and into another. Julian closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. We stood facing each other in the small entryway, the weight of everything unspoken and everything decided settling around us like snow. 6 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table in a house that felt too large and too quiet, watching the first snow of winter begin to fall outside the window where Clara used to keep her small herb garden. The ceramic dish beside my coffee cup held 2 wedding rings, the gold worn smooth by years of wear, catching the gray light of the November afternoon. The house held the echo of a family life that had been carefully dismantled over the past month. Clara had moved into her sister's spare bedroom with the children, a temporary arrangement while we sorted through lawyers and custody schedules and the thousand practical details that accumulate when a marriage ends. Emma and Marcus would be with me every other weekend and Wednesday evenings for dinner, a routine that felt inadequate but was the best we could manage given the circumstances. The divorce had been as amicable as such things can be when one person's truth shatters the foundation of what two people had built together. Clara had been devastating in her kindness, helping me pack boxes of my belongings and asking only that I be gentle with the children's questions, that I give them time to understand that sometimes love changes shape but doesn't disappear entirely. I tried to explain to Emma and Marcus why Daddy was moving to a different house, why Mommy seemed sad even when she smiled, why the rhythms of their daily life had shifted so suddenly. 9-year-old Marcus had nodded with the serious expression he wore when processing difficult information, while 6-year-old Emma had mostly wanted to know if she could still have her bedtime stories and whether I would remember to pack her favorite stuffed elephant when she came to visit. Their acceptance was both heartbreaking and healing, a reminder that children are often more resilient than the adults who worry about protecting them from life's complexities. I picked up the pen beside the notepad where I'd been trying to write a letter to Clara, something beyond the practical communications that had filled our recent conversations. Not an explanation, because I'd already tried to explain and found that some truths resist simple articulation. Not an apology, because what I'd done wasn't something that could be forgiven or not forgiven, just acknowledged and lived with. Instead, I wanted to thank her for the 12 years we'd shared, for the way she'd loved me as completely as she could, for the grace with which she'd handled my confession and the impossible situation it had created, for Emma and Marcus, who were the best of both of us combined, for building a life that had been good and stable and filled with the kind of quiet love that matters even when it isn't enough. The snow continued to fall as I wrote, covering the familiar landscape of our neighborhood in the season's first transformation. By the time I finished the letter, the world outside looked different, softened, and reimagined by the accumulation of something new. I sealed the letter in an envelope and left it on the kitchen counter where Clara would find it when she came by later to pick up the last of the children's winter clothes. Then I locked the door behind me and drove through the falling snow to the train station where Julian was waiting. We'd been taking these evening trips into the city several times a week, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for the ride itself, and the conversations that seemed to flow more easily when we were in motion, when the landscape outside the windows was changing and we didn't have to make eye contact if the topics grew too intense. But tonight felt different as we settled into seats beside each other rather than across the small table where we'd sat during those first charged encounters. Julian's shoulder touched mine as the train pulled away from the station, a point of contact that would have felt electric with possibility weeks ago, but now carried the comfortable weight of certainty. His hand found mine as we picked up speed, our fingers intertwining with the kind of natural ease that suggested this was how we'd always been meant to sit together. I could feel the steady rhythm of his pulse where his wrist pressed against mine, that same heartbeat I'd felt through his chest on so many significant nights, but now without the tremor of uncertainty that had made it feel fragile. We talked quietly as the train carried us through the snowy countryside, about small things mostly. Julian's plans to return to Chicago in the spring, where he'd been offered a position at a different literary magazine. My decision to follow him there, to find work in a new city and begin the process of building a life that felt authentic rather than simply responsible. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence as we traveled deeper into the evening, the train's rhythm creating a kind of meditation that made words unnecessary. Outside the windows, the snow continued to fall on farmhouses and small towns, on the landscape of our childhood and the life I was choosing to leave behind. As we approached a long tunnel that would take us under the ridge outside the city, Julian turned to look at me in the dim light of the passenger car. His eyes held the same intensity they'd carried that first night when he'd placed my hand over his heart. But now there was peace there too, the calm that comes from finally being able to speak truth instead of carrying it in silence. The train entered the tunnel with the rushing sound of displaced air, and everything outside the windows went dark. In that enclosed space, moving through the mountain toward whatever waited on the other side. Julian's hand tightened slightly over mine, and I felt his heartbeat synchronize with the rhythm of wheels on tracks. For a moment, there was nothing but that sound, that steady percussion that measured our movement from one place to another, from one version of ourselves to another. The fluorescent lights of the passenger car created a small island of visibility in the surrounding darkness, and in that island were two hands resting together, two people who had found their way back to something they'd lost without ever knowing they'd been looking for it. When the train emerged from the tunnel into the lights of the city beyond, we were still sitting like that, still moving forward together into whatever came next. The transformation was complete, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet way that real change happens, 1 mile at a time, one choice at a time, one heartbeat at a time.